In 1962, a retired Navy pilot named David Bunga sat down at his typewriter and began writing what he called the most important manuscript of his life. Bunga had flown alongside Admiral Richard Byrd during Operation High Jump in 1947, the largest Antarctic expedition in history. What he witnessed during those frozen months would haunt him for 15 years before he finally decided to tell the truth. The manuscript was printed exactly once by a small publishing house in Ohio. Within 3 months, every copy had been pulled from circulation. The publisher refused to discuss it. Bunga died 6 years later, and his family was told to never mention the document again. For decades, the manuscript was considered lost. But in 2004, a single copy surfaced in an estate sale in Oregon, tucked inside a hollowed-out Bible. What it contained wasn't just a story about Antarctica. It was a complete rewriting of everything we'd been told about Admiral Byrd's final expedition, the true purpose of Operation High Jump, and what the U.S. military actually found beneath the ice in 1947. This is what David Bunga wrote, this is why it was buried, and this is why it matters right now. If you're interested in revisionist history, suppressed government operations, and the alternative narratives around Antarctica that mainstream sources won't touch, hit subscribe. I cover these topics every week, pulling from declassified documents, military testimonies, and manuscripts like Bunga's that challenge the official story. Now let's talk about what Bunga actually claimed. David Bunga wasn't some conspiracy theorist writing from his basement. He was a decorated naval aviator with over 3,000 flight hours, a combat veteran of the Pacific Theater, and one of only 12 pilots selected for Operation High Jump. His service record was spotless. His reputation in naval aviation circles was solid. He had nothing to gain and everything to lose by writing this manuscript. That's what makes it so disturbing. According to Bunga's account, Operation High Jump was publicly framed as a scientific mission to test equipment in polar conditions and establish research bases for future Antarctic operations. The official story claimed that 13 ships, 23 aircraft, and over 4,000 personnel were deployed to Antarctica in December 1946 for routine exploration and mapping. President Truman approved the mission. The Navy presented it as a straightforward logistical exercise. The media coverage was minimal, mostly focused on the adventure aspect of exploring uncharted territory. But Bunga's manuscript tells a completely different story. He claimed the mission wasn't about science or exploration at all. It was a military operation designed to locate and neutralize what he called advanced underground installations that had been detected by reconnaissance flights in late 1946. These weren't natural formations. Bunga described them as vast subterranean complexes with infrastructure that shouldn't have existed, built with construction techniques that predated modern industrial methods by what he estimated to be centuries. Bunga wrote that the installations weren't abandoned. They were active, maintained, and defended. Here's where his account gets specific. Bunga described flying reconnaissance missions over an area he referred to as the Bunga Hills, a region of ice-free land near the coast of Wilkes Land in East Antarctica. During one flight in January 1947, his crew detected unusual electromagnetic readings coming from beneath the ice sheet, approximately 40 miles inland from the coast. When they descended to investigate, they observed what Bunga described as geometric patterns visible through breaks in the ice, patterns that suggested deliberate construction rather than natural geological formations. He wrote that these patterns extended for miles, forming what appeared to be a grid system with structures spaced at regular intervals. The structures themselves were partially exposed where the ice had receded, revealing walls made of a dark, polished stone that reflected light in a way that seemed wrong to him. He couldn't explain it better than that in the manuscript. The stone just looked wrong, like it had been fused or molded rather than cut and stacked. What disturbed Bunga most wasn't the structures themselves. It was the fact that when his plane circled back for a second pass, the electromagnetic interference intensified to the point where his instruments began failing. His altimeter spun wildly. His compass locked onto a bearing that didn't correspond to magnetic north. The radio filled with static, punctuated by what he described as rhythmic pulses, almost like Morse code but following no pattern he recognized. Then the temperature inside the cockpit dropped 20 degrees in less than a minute, despite the heating system running at full capacity. Bunga's co-pilot, a man named Lieutenant Davis, reported seeing movement on the ice below. Not animals, not weather phenomena. Movement that suggested coordinated activity, figures moving between the exposed structures in patterns that implied organization and purpose. When Bunga descended lower to get a better look, Davis took photographs with the standard reconnaissance camera mounted in the aircraft's belly. Those photographs, according to Bunga, were confiscated immediately upon landing. Davis was debriefed separately and reassigned to a different unit within 48 hours. Bunga never saw him again. Attempts to contact Davis after the mission were blocked. Letters went unanswered. Phone calls were redirected. When Bunga finally tracked down Davis's family in 1955, he was told that Davis had died in a training accident in 1949. No details were provided. No obituary existed in any public record. Bunga wrote that Admiral Byrd himself seemed shaken by what the reconnaissance flights were revealing. Byrd had been to Antarctica multiple times before Operation High Jump. He knew the continent. He understood the risks and the environmental challenges. But something about this mission was different. Bunga claimed that Byrd held private meetings with senior officers that excluded most of the command staff, meetings where voices were raised and arguments broke out over what the expedition should do next. The official timeline states that Operation High Jump was cut short in February 1947, weeks ahead of schedule, due to unexpected weather conditions and equipment failures. The fleet returned to the United States, and Byrd submitted his report to the Navy Department. That report remains classified to this day. Public statements at the time emphasized the mission's success in mapping coastline and testing cold weather gear, but journalists who covered Byrd's return noted that he seemed different, more reserved and unwilling to discuss details that would normally excite him. Bunga's manuscript claims the real reason the mission was terminated had nothing to do with weather. It was because the expedition encountered resistance. He described an incident in late January 1947, where a landing party was sent to investigate one of the exposed structures near the Bunga Hills. The party consisted of 8 men, including 2 scientists, 4 Marines, and 2 naval officers. They were equipped with standard cold weather gear, survey equipment, and weapons for protection against potential wildlife threats, though no significant wildlife existed in that region. The party established radio contact upon landing and began their approach to the nearest structure, a rectangular building partially embedded in the ice with an entrance that appeared to descend underground. Bunga's plane circled overhead to maintain visual contact while a second aircraft monitored radio communications. For the first 20 minutes, the landing party reported normal conditions. They described the structure's exterior as smooth and featureless, with no visible seams or joints in the stone, as if the entire building had been carved from a single piece of material. The entrance was a simple rectangular opening, no door visible, leading to a ramp that descended at a gentle angle into darkness. One of the scientists noted that the temperature inside the entrance was warmer than the exterior air, which made no sense given that there were no heat sources and the structure should have been frozen solid. The temperature differential was significant, approximately 15 degrees warmer than outside, creating a thermal gradient that shouldn't exist in an inert stone structure buried under Antarctic ice for what mainstream science claims would be thousands of years. The Marines went in first, their boots echoing against stone floors that were smooth and level, showing no signs of ice accumulation or frost, despite the extreme cold just meters away at the entrance. The scientists followed, their instruments detecting electromagnetic readings that spiked as they descended deeper. The naval officers remained at the entrance to relay communications, setting up a field radio to maintain contact with the circling aircraft. That's when the transmission changed. Bunga wrote that the tone of the Marines' voices shifted from professional reporting to confusion, then alarm. They described seeing lights deeper in the structure, lights that weren't coming from any equipment they'd brought. The lights were pale blue, steady rather than flickering, and they lined the walls at regular intervals as if the structure was powered and functional. The Marines estimated the lights were positioned every 10 feet along both walls, receding into the darkness ahead, implying the corridor extended far deeper than they could see. The light source itself was embedded in the walls, not mounted on them. There were no fixtures, no bulbs, no visible power conduits. The stone itself seemed to emit the glow, a soft luminescence that provided enough illumination to navigate, but not enough to see details clearly. One of the Marines tapped his rifle stock against the wall near one of the lights, expecting stone to chip or crack. Instead, the wall absorbed the impact with a dull thud, as if the material had some form of density or composition that resisted percussion. One of the scientists called up to say they'd found what appeared to be text carved into the walls, symbols and characters that didn't match any known language. The other scientist was documenting it with photographs when the first Marines started shouting. Bunga couldn't make out the exact words through the static, but the panic was unmistakable. Then the transmission cut out entirely. The circling aircraft tried to re-establish contact. Nothing. They descended lower, trying to get a visual on the entrance. They saw the 2 naval officers running back toward the landing site, stumbling through the snow, looking back over their shoulders at the entrance. Behind them, coming out of the structure, were figures. Bunga described them in his manuscript as humanoid, but wrong in their proportions. Too tall, too thin, moving in a way that didn't match human biomechanics. They wore no protective gear despite the sub-zero temperatures, and they moved with coordinated precision, fanning out from the entrance in a formation that suggested military training. The two naval officers made it back to the aircraft and took off immediately, abandoning the rest of the landing party. The pilots circling overhead watched as the figures returned to the structure, herding the remaining 6 men back inside. Then the entrance sealed itself. Not with the door sliding into place, but the stone itself seemed to flow and merge, closing the opening as if it had never existed. Radio contact was never re-established. The 6 men were never recovered. Their names don't appear on any casualty lists from Operation High Jump. When Bunga tried to find records of their service after returning to the United States, he discovered that their personnel files had been expunged. It was as if they'd never been part of the expedition at all. Admiral Byrd ordered an immediate withdrawal after that incident. Bunga's manuscript claims that Byrd held an emergency briefing with the entire command staff, where he stated that the expedition had encountered forces beyond their operational capacity and that further engagement would result in unacceptable casualties. He recommended terminating the mission, returning to the United States, and submitting a classified report to the Joint Chiefs of Staff with a recommendation for a completely different approach to Antarctica. That recommendation, according to Bunga, was ignored. Instead, the Navy classified every aspect of what had been discovered, reassigned personnel to different units to prevent them from comparing notes, and instituted a policy of complete silence regarding the true findings of Operation High Jump. Byrd was debriefed extensively, his report was sealed, and he was sent on a carefully managed press tour, where he made vague statements about the strategic importance of Antarctica and the need for international cooperation in future polar research. Bunga wrote that Byrd was never the same after that mission. He became withdrawn, gave fewer interviews, and seemed haunted by something he couldn't discuss publicly. When Byrd died in 1957, Bunga attended the funeral. He wrote that Byrd's final words to him, spoken during a brief conversation at a naval reception in 1955, were a warning. Byrd told him that what they'd found in Antarctica wasn't just about science or history, it was about control. Control of narratives, control of resources, and control of information that could rewrite humanity's understanding of its own past. 2 years after Byrd's death, Bunga started working on the manuscript. Now here's where this connects to the broader narrative that revisionist historians and Tartaria researchers have been documenting for years. If Bunga's account is accurate, what was found in Antarctica in 1947 wasn't just isolated structures. It was evidence of a technologically advanced civilization that existed before the historical timeline we're taught in school, a civilization capable of construction techniques and energy systems that we still can't fully replicate today. This fits the pattern. Across the world, researchers have identified megalithic structures, buried cities, and architectural anomalies that suggest the existence of a global civilization that was far more advanced than mainstream archaeology acknowledges. The Tartarian hypothesis proposes that this civilization was systematically erased from historical records during the 18th and 19th centuries as part of a deliberate effort to establish a new timeline and consolidate power, under a specific historical narrative. Antarctica would have been the perfect place to hide evidence of that civilization. Remote, inaccessible, covered by ice for thousands of years, and protected by international treaties that limit exploration and enforce strict research protocols. The Antarctic Treaty, signed in 1959, just 12 years after Operation High Jump, prohibits military activity, mineral mining, and nuclear testing on the continent. It also establishes a framework of international oversight that effectively controls who can go there and what they can investigate. Convenient timing, isn't it? Bunga's manuscript suggests that what the US military found in 1947 was so significant that it required an international framework to keep it contained. Not just a treaty to prevent territorial disputes or protect the environment, but a system designed to ensure that no single nation could excavate, study, or reveal what's actually under that ice without approval from a coalition of governments that all have a vested interest in maintaining the current historical narrative. And here's the thing. Bunga wasn't the only one talking about this. In 1956, Admiral Byrd gave an interview to a Chilean newspaper called El Mercurio. In that interview, which has been cited by researchers for decades but is difficult to verify through original sources, Byrd allegedly stated that the United States needed to prepare defenses against hostile regions capable of flying from pole to pole at incredible speeds. He reportedly said that, in the event of a new war, America could be attacked by fighters that possess fantastic speed and are able to fly from one pole to another with incredible velocity. That statement doesn't make sense in the context of Cold War geopolitics. The Soviet Union didn't have bases in Antarctica. No nation in 1956 had aircraft capable of flying pole to pole at fantastic speeds. So, what was Byrd talking about? Bunger's manuscript provides context. He claimed that during Operation High Jump, reconnaissance aircraft encountered craft that outperformed anything in the US military's inventory. These weren't planes. They didn't have visible propulsion systems, no jet engines, no propellers, and they moved in ways that defied aerodynamics as understood at the time. They appeared near the structures the expedition was investigating, observed the aircraft from a distance, and in at least 2 documented encounters, they disabled aircraft systems without making physical contact. One of those encounters involved Bunger's own plane. He described a disc-shaped object, metallic and seamless, that appeared off his starboard wing during a reconnaissance flight over the Ross Ice Shelf. The object paced his aircraft for approximately 7 minutes, matching his speed and altitude with precision that seemed impossible. It maintained a consistent distance of roughly 200 feet, close enough that Bunger could observe details through the cockpit window. The surface of the object was smooth, reflecting the sunlight in a way that made it difficult to look at directly, almost like polished mercury. There were no rivets, no panel lines, no visible means of propulsion, no exhaust, no heat distortion, no sound penetrating the cockpit despite the proximity. It simply existed there in the air, defying every principle of aerodynamics Bunger had learned in over 3,000 hours of flight time. When Bunger attempted to change course, banking his aircraft to the left to see if the object would follow, it moved to block him, shifting position instantly without any visible acceleration or deceleration. It simply appeared in his new flight path, forcing him back onto his original heading. The maneuver was instantaneous, as if the object didn't need to travel through the intervening space to reposition itself. His co-pilot tried to photograph it, but the camera malfunctioned. The shutter mechanism jammed, and the film inside the camera was later found to be completely blank when developed, as if it had been exposed to some form of radiation or electromagnetic field that wiped the emulsion clean. His radio operator tried to report it, but the radio went dead, all frequencies returning only static, despite the equipment being in perfect working order just minutes before. Then the object accelerated straight up and vanished into the clouds so fast that Bunger didn't even see it leave. One moment it was there, the next it was gone, and his instruments rebooted as if nothing had happened. The altimeter reset to 0 and climbed back to their current altitude. The compass spun twice before locking onto magnetic north. The radio crackled back to life mid-transmission from their base, as if no interruption had occurred. When Bunger reported the encounter upon landing, he was told to classify it as atmospheric phenomena and never mention it again. Other pilots had similar experiences. At least 4 aircraft reported encounters with unknown craft during Operation High Jump, and all of those reports were buried in classified files that still haven't been declassified 77 years later. Bunger believed these craft were connected to the structures beneath the ice. He theorized that whatever civilization built those installations also developed technology that we're only beginning to understand now. Technology based on principles of energy manipulation and propulsion that don't fit into our current scientific frameworks. And if that technology still exists, still functions, then whoever controls access to it controls a strategic advantage that dwarfs anything else on the planet. That's why the manuscript was suppressed. Think about it. If Bunger's account became public in 1962, at the height of the Cold War, what would that mean? It would mean admitting that the United States military encountered forces in Antarctica that it couldn't overcome, that there are technologies buried under the ice that predate modern civilization, and that the entire historical timeline taught in schools is incomplete at best and deliberately false at worst. It would also mean admitting that Admiral Byrd, one of the most famous explorers in American history, had been silenced about the most important discovery of his career. That his final expedition wasn't about science or glory, but about encountering something that fundamentally challenged everything we think we know about human history and technological development. So the manuscript was printed once, pulled from circulation, and Bunger was quietly warned to drop it. The publisher, a small operation in Ohio with no major distribution network, was pressured to destroy the remaining copies. Bunger complied. He never spoke publicly about the manuscript again, and when he died in 1968, his family was instructed to burn his personal papers. But one copy survived, hidden in a Bible, purchased at an estate sale, and eventually digitized by researchers who recognized its significance. Now, let's talk about what happened after Operation High Jump, because the story doesn't end in 1947. Between 1947 and 1959, the US military conducted multiple classified operations in Antarctica, most of which remain undisclosed to this day. We know they happened because budget allocations show funding directed toward polar research and logistical support for Antarctic operations, but the details of those missions are still classified. What were they doing down there for 12 years? In 1958, the US Navy launched Operation Deep Freeze, which was publicly framed as a scientific research initiative to support the International Geophysical Year. Deep Freeze established permanent research stations, conducted extensive mapping, and deployed advanced equipment for subsurface exploration. It's still ongoing today, with annual deployments that support research activities across the continent. But researchers have pointed out inconsistencies in the official narrative. Why does a scientific operation require such heavy military involvement? Why are large sections of Antarctica still off-limits to civilian researchers? And why do satellite images of certain regions show geometric patterns beneath the ice that aren't explained by natural geological processes? Bunger's manuscript suggests that the US military has been quietly excavating and studying the structures discovered during Operation High Jump for decades, using scientific research as cover for what's actually a long-term archaeological and technological recovery operation. If that's true, then everything we've been told about Antarctica is a lie designed to hide the biggest discovery in human history. And it's not just the United States. Russia, China, and several European nations have all established research stations in Antarctica, and all of them are subject to the same treaty restrictions that prevent militarization and limit mining. But research stations require massive logistical support, they consume enormous amounts of energy, and they're staffed year-round despite the extreme conditions. What kind of research justifies that level of investment in one of the most inhospitable places on Earth? The official answer is climate science, glaciology, and astronomy. The real answer might be something else entirely. Here's something else Bunger wrote in his manuscript that connects to current events. He claimed that the structures he observed weren't just buildings. They were part of a network, a system of interconnected installations that extended across multiple regions of Antarctica and possibly beyond. He theorized that the continent was once the hub of a global civilization, a center of power and technological development that was eventually buried by cataclysmic climate shifts that froze the continent and wiped out most evidence of its existence. This aligns with geological evidence showing that Antarctica was once much warmer, covered in forests, and home to diverse ecosystems. Core samples taken from Antarctic ice have revealed pollen, plant matter, and even evidence of large animals that couldn't survive in the current climate. Mainstream science explains this as plate tectonics and gradual climate change over millions of years. But what if the timeline is wrong? What if Antarctica froze much more recently than we're told? And what if that freeze was the result of the same cataclysm that wiped out the Tartarian civilization and forced a reset of human history? Bunger didn't have answers to those questions, but he believed they were worth asking. He believed that the suppression of his manuscript was part of a larger pattern of historical erasure designed to prevent people from questioning the established narrative. And he believed that eventually the truth would come out, because the structures beneath the ice aren't going anywhere. And as technology improves, it will become harder and harder to hide what's really down there. That brings us to 2024, and the questions we should be asking right now. Why are multiple nations suddenly increasing their presence in Antarctica? Why has the US military been quietly upgrading its Antarctic infrastructure over the past decade? And why are there persistent reports from researchers and contractors working in Antarctica about strange phenomena, equipment malfunctions, and restricted zones that even high-level personnel aren't allowed to access? If Bunger's manuscript is accurate, then what we're witnessing now isn't just scientific research. It's a race to control whatever's under that ice before the general public finds out it exists. And if that technology is as advanced as Bunger claimed, then whoever controls it controls the future. The manuscript ends with a warning. Bunger wrote that the forces he encountered in Antarctica in 1947 weren't hostile in the way we usually think about hostility. They didn't attack unprovoked. They defended their territory when it was intruded upon, and they demonstrated capabilities that made it clear they could have inflicted far greater harm if they'd wanted to. He believed that humanity was being watched, tested, and judged based on how we handle the knowledge of what's really beneath the ice. He also believed that the suppression of that knowledge is temporary, because truth has a way of surfacing no matter how hard authorities try to bury it. His manuscript was his attempt to ensure that when the truth finally comes out, there's a record from someone who was actually there, someone who saw it firsthand and understood the implications. That copy found in the Bible in 2004 has been digitized and circulated among researchers, historians, and anyone willing to question the official story. It's not widely known, it's not discussed in mainstream media, and the name David Bunger doesn't appear in any mainstream historical accounts. But for those paying attention, for those willing to dig into the suppressed history of Antarctica and the evidence of advanced pre-modern civilizations, Bunger's manuscript is one of the most important primary sources we have. It's a first-hand account from a credible witness describing discoveries that would rewrite everything we know about human history, technological development, and the true nature of the world we live in. It's a document that was suppressed for over 40 years, hidden, and nearly lost forever. And it's a reminder that what we're told is true, and what's actually true are often two very different things. So what do we do with this information? We keep asking questions. We keep looking for evidence. We keep challenging narratives that don't add up. And we keep sharing documents like Bunger's manuscript, because the more people who know about them, the harder they are to suppress. If you want to go deeper into the Tartaria hypothesis, the Antarctic anomalies, and the evidence of suppressed civilizations, I've covered those topics in previous videos. There's a whole network of researchers, historians, and investigators piecing together a version of history that's very different from what we were taught. And the more you look into it, the more the patterns start to make sense. Subscribe if you want to stay updated on this kind of content. Next week, I'm covering declassified documents from the CIA's remote viewing program and what they revealed about geological anomalies beneath the Antarctic ice sheet. It connects directly to what Bunger described, and the implications are staggering. Until then, keep questioning, keep digging, and remember that the truth doesn't fear investigation.